This is a keynote session called 6 Ways Population Change Will Affect the Global Economy. It's based on a paper done by Ronald Lee and Andy Mason, who are, I think it's a real honor for us. They are two of the most preeminent economic demographers who have worked in this area for decades. And they are the two that are behind who developed the entire national transfer accounts approach and the entire project. So I think this is a very interesting session. They will be giving their presentation, a recorded presentation. Afterwards, we have Aris Ananta, who is an economic demographer at the Universitas Indonesia. And he is also an economic demographer. As I said, he is also actually the president of the Asian Population Association. He will be giving his remarks. After that, I'll give the time to back to Andy and Ron if they have any responses, anything they want to say back about the comments that they had received from Aris. And at the end, we'll open it to comments, discussion, questions from the floor. So I think we're ready to go. If you could start, please. Phil, we can start the first presentation, which is the one by Andy Mason and Ronald Lee.
Hi. So I think everyone here understands the kind of population changes that are going to be coming over the coming decades. We have low fertility, a high life expectancy, so we can expect to have population aging, slower population growth, and in some countries, population decline. There's probably less agreement about what the economic effects of that are likely to be. But that's the subject matter that we're addressing in this paper, and I'm working with Ron Lee, but also members of the NTA network who contributed to this paper, and there are over 70 of them who are listed here. So, is population aging, declining population, a looming crisis? Well, if you read what's in the media, not surprisingly, it's pictured as a looming crisis, but not everyone thinks that. And I think there's a lot of interesting questions to decide to what extent is this a crisis or not, and we're going to talk about that. So our assessment uses a simple model that's just a product of the interaction between changes in population size and age structure and the human life cycle. So what do I mean by the human life cycle? Well, we know that the young and the old consume more than they produce through their labor. And people at young and old ages, often called dependents, rely on resources generated during the working ages. So changes in population age structure clearly create economic imbalances. Some of them are good and some are bad, and they express themselves in important ways. So the data and methods we use are as follows. So population estimates and projections come from the most recent edition of UN World Population Prospects, the National Transfer Account estimates of labor income and consumption by age for 186 economies come from the NTA network. And so labor income includes earnings, the labor share of self-employment income, and the value of unpaid family labor. Consumption is a broad measure. It's both public and private consumption as measured in the system of national accounts and allocated across age. The construction of these profiles relies on methods that are described in the UN National Transfer Accounts Manual that's available online. So this illustrates the kind of data that we're using. And the purpose is to emphasize that we have data for each country, and that is used to look at the economic effects changing population in each country and then aggregate it up to get the total values. So I'm not going to go into the details here, but the key point is that labor income profiles and consumption vary across country depending upon the kinds of policies, the levels of income, the decisions that policymakers are making, and so forth. And so it's important to incorporate this in the analysis. So we combine population counts by age, both estimates and projections, with fixed age profiles of per capita labor income and consumption to construct various measures like the size of the effective labor force, or the support ratio, the demographic dividend, and so forth. The thing I want to emphasize is that these are all business as usual scenarios. So no response by governments or individuals is being considered. And hopefully governments and individuals will respond to changes in population age structure, but we're estimating what will happen if they don't. So the first finding is that the era of population-driven economic growth is ending. So we decompose the growth in global GDP into two components. One is the growth of productivity, or GDP per effective worker, and the other is the growth of effective labor. So the productivity is based on historical estimates for the most part. We use the values that we use will reflect the effects of capital deepening, human capital investment, innovation, and other factors. But population doesn't play an indirect role that is being assessed here. The growth of effective labor is where population is really having an impact. It incorporates the number of people who are at each age and how that's changing over time, and what kind of labor income people at that age produce. So this incorporates the effects across countries on the level of labor productivity. And this is very important because changes in the number of workers in a country with very low labor productivity will have much less impact on global GDP than changes in a country which has very high labor productivity. So, briefly, what's the outcome of this analysis? Well, we can look at the historical data first from 1950 to 2020. And I think a key point here is that the peak growth of effective labor occurred in 1975 to 2000. And at that time, effective labor was growing by 1.7% per year. And we see that that's declined since then, but it's going to be very small between 2020 and 2060, growing at only 0.14% per year. So the share of growth due to population drops from...
Sorry, everyone, we are going to try and restart the video and put it back where we just stopped so we can get a better resolution. It's impossible to see the screen. This will be back on, hopefully. Yeah, it doesn't look a lot.
0.14% per year. So the share of growth due to population drops from 58% to 6%. So almost all of GDP growth will depend on growth of productivity and not growth in the sheer number of workers. The second finding, population change will drive large regional shifts in economic activity. Well, regions aren't really organized, in the normal kind of definition by their demographic characteristics. So, for example, the countries that are experiencing a decline in the effective number of workers are in Europe and they're in Eastern Asia. And we've grouped them together in this figure. And you can see that for the next 40 years, the effective number of workers is expected to decline by 0.5% per year, down from over 1% between 1950 and 2020. So if we group the Americas, Southeast Asia, and Oceania, except for Melanesia, we see growth in the effective number of workers in the next 40 years will be about 0.3% per year. Positive, although very slow. And this is, again, a very sharp decline from what was experienced between 1950 and 2020. Now, we'll just kind of combine Group 3 and Group 4 together. I suppose, in a way, Group 4 is the most interesting because it is going to experience the most rapid growth in the effective number of workers over the next 40 years at around 1.5% per year. So this is still slower than what they've been experiencing, but still quite robust growth. Now, the third factor I want to emphasize is that prime-age adults, it seems, are being squeezed by population aging. So the idea here is that resources are, at any point in time, a fixed pie. Mostly it's prime-age adults who are the first ones who lay their hands on these resources because they have asset income, and heavily they have labor income. And so what do they do with that? To what extent do they share it with seniors and with children, or to what extent do they keep it for themselves? Well, there's been a lot of speculation and research about this issue in the past. Here's what our data shows us. This is a very simple kind of analysis. It's not a projection. This is comparative data for about 2010. And we've taken the 173, no, well, actually, yeah, less than that, around 173 countries, and we've divided them and by what the consumption at old ages is and what the consumption at young ages. So on the vertical axis, we have consumption of people 65 and older relative to consumption 25 to 64. And you can see that on average, seniors have about the same per capita consumption as prime-age adults. And then if we look at children, that's measured on the horizontal axis, you can see that on average, children have about 80% of the consumption of prime-age adults. So there's a lot of differences across countries, though, and the red ones are the ones that are aging, that are oldest, and Japan, for example. And you can see that most of these countries fall in the eastern quadrant, which means that they have high consumption of seniors and they have high consumption of children. And so who does this affect? Well, it's prime-age adults that are getting squeezed by this behavior. 4 addresses how changes in age structure affect per capita income, not total income, which we were talking about earlier. So this really depends on the region or the kind of country that we're talking about. So changes in age structure are likely to boost per capita economic growth in low and lower middle income countries, but it's likely to inhibit growth in high and upper middle income countries. So to reach that conclusion, we rely on the support ratio, which is the number of workers, effective workers, relative to the number of effective consumers. And you can see that starting in the 1970s or so, in a lot of the regions of the world, not low-income countries, but elsewhere, the support ratio began to rise. And so this led to a boost to standards of living. So the first dividend, which is the rate of growth of the support ratio, is positive during this era. The low-income countries experienced the demographic dividend somewhat later. It started near the turn of the century, around 2000, and it's going to be occurring in the future while other countries, while the high and middle-income countries are experiencing decline. So the fifth point, population aging, viewed from an economic perspective, is accelerating sharply in high-income and upper middle-income countries. So how do we reach this conclusion? Well, to judge aging from an economic perspective, we take a simple measure. We say, well, what is the amount of consumption beyond labor income that must be funded by labor income? So seniors have a big gap between their consumption and their labor income, and so they must rely on resources that come from different possibilities, but one of them could be labor income. So let's suppose that taxes on labor income was used to fund the old age gap entirely. So in 2020, that would mean that about a quarter of labor income would be required, or it would have to be taxed in order to fund old age needs. For countries and other income groups, aging is much further along, but also consumption at older ages is lower in these countries. So that also has an effect on our conclusion. The thing that really strikes me about this figure is how sharply the old age gap is rising. So it rose very slowly for many decades, but now it's really accelerated, and so we see this rapid increase in high-income countries, but also in upper middle-income countries. But the increase will be greatest in high-income countries, and the old age gap would reach 45% of total labor income by 2060 if we don't do anything about it. Okay, so population aging will increase pressure for more private assets and or more public debt. The impact on capital is uncertain. Well, let me elaborate on this a bit. So what are we measuring here? So we could ask for any individual, including yourself, how much assets would I need in order to fund my old age needs? And that would depend on how much you're going to consume and what your labor income was and how long you were going to live and what kind of return you could receive on your assets. Now, we could take that for an individual and we could add it up for every individual in the country. And this is what we would find expressed as a percentage of total labor income. So in 1980, people living in, say, low-income countries would need wealth of about 100% of labor income. In high-income countries, it would be around 500% of labor income to fund their old age needs. As you can see, this is rising slowly in low-income countries, a little faster in lower middle-income countries, and very rapidly in upper middle-income and high-income countries. So in high-income countries, by 2060, the resources that would be needed to fund old age would be 13 times total labor income. So, is that going to happen? Well, it's not going to happen just by increasing saving and accumulating capital. That's one possibility. But there are other ways that people can generate wealth that can help to meet their material needs in old age. One would be we could embrace programs to some extent that fund old age needs through transfers. And if we do that, that's going to increase the burden of aging on future generations. Now, we may also need to calibrate the way that we earn labor income and our consumption. So we may have to retire later, maintain higher productivity at older ages in order to reduce the needs from assets. The other thing we could do is to reduce consumption. And that could maybe be done in part by, say, having a more efficient approach to healthcare costs. It could also be done by just people sacrificing standards of living. Maybe they don't want to do that. Maybe they do. Maybe people would be satisfied to consume less on average in return for living longer. So those are the 6 main conclusions that we reach in this paper. To return to the question I first asked about whether we're looking at a crisis and the disagreements about that, I think the reason for this is that the prospects are really very mixed. There are some very positive developments that come from the changes in population. If we just look at the economic sphere, slower GDP growth is likely to reduce environmental strains. Higher standards of living in lower income countries are certainly a welcome development, and they may lead to a decline in the differences between income levels and consumption levels in poor countries and rich countries. And third, we might see increased capital intensity and higher productivity as aging occurs. So this would lead to higher income and help to offset some of the effects of aging. But there are some negative developments in aging societies, and we need to understand these and ways that we can respond to minimize the adverse impacts we're likely to experience. So we will have declining support ratios with slower improvements and possibly even decline in living standards. Secondly, we may see particular age groups hit hard by changes in age structure. If we look at existing comparative data, it looks like working age adults are being squeezed severely by population aging. So that's certainly a matter of some concern. Third, we know that there will be a lot of pressure to expand transfer programs that support the elderly. This is likely to lead to high tax rates and burden future generations in ways that we really don't want to do. And in a related way, it's very likely that it will that aging will strain public finances, leading to high levels of public debt. Well, there are many other positive and negative developments that arise with population change that we could talk about, and I'm sure many of you would have ideas about what those are likely to be. But these are the 6 things that we really wanted to highlight. This seemed most important and clear to us, and so I want to thank you for this opportunity to talk about how we view these trends. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll now have the comments, discussant remarks from Eris Ananta. Bill, you can put that on now.
Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to give comment to Andy's very important presentation. The title of my comment is Challenges and Potential of NTA in a Changing World. But first of all, I would like to mention that I am not an expert on NTA. I know little about NTA. Therefore, it is a comment from an outsider on NTA. Please forgive me if I misinterpret the NTA. When I first learned about NTA, my mind went to CBR, crude birth rate, and TFR, total fertility rate. CBR does not take age sex composition of the population into account. TFR does. National income does not consider age sex composition of the population. I thought that NTA is age standardized national income. It is not, but it can be. With the data produced by NTA, we can do it. Andy started his presentation with this question. Is declining population an alarming crisis? To me, WHO Active Aging Framework and Amartya Sen Capability Approach are examples of a framework or an approach which can be used to create public policies to avert the alarming crisis and turn the declining population into an opportunity. Economic growth is affected by so many factors, including pandemic, climate crisis, security, and population dynamics. However, in this paper, Andy Mason is focusing on one only to show how population dynamics affect economic growth. This is the framework Andy Mason used to analyze the impact of population dynamics on economic growth. He started from population dynamics, which affect a change in its structure, and then change in effective labor and effective consumers. This is one of the innovations of NTA. Then coupled with labor productivity, another innovation of NTA, resulting in economic growth. Andy measured population dynamics as fertility and mortality only. However, population dynamics is affected by fertility, mortality, and population mobility. I hope that the next NTA will consider population mobility as part of the population dynamics, which also affect then economic growth. One feature of the current NTA is that the flow is one way from population dynamics to economic growth. Further study on NTA can try to expand it by having more than one-way flow, that is, from economic growth to population dynamics. Another feature of the current NTA is that it is not considering the impact of population dynamics on aggregate demand in the economy. I believe that NTA is very flexible so that the future NTA can take into account of the impact of population dynamics on aggregate demand in the economy. We know that in aging society, for example, we could create silver economy. Another feature of the current NTA is that it is a closed economy model, no international trade, no international capital flow, and no international population mobility, not only migration. Same thing here. I am sure that the future NTA can take this one into account and relax the assumption of no international trade, no international capital flow, no international population mobility. This is the most important innovation in NTA, the use of life cycle theory. The population has three groups: the young period, when people are consuming more than producing; the productive period, when people are producing more than consuming; the old period, when people are consuming more than producing. The young period is called a deficit period because at this time they consume more than producing. The same thing for the old period, they consume more than produce. In the productive period, they produce more than consume. That means they have surplus. The innovation is that the NTA doesn't use chronological age to define young and old, but defining by whether people are consuming more or less than producing. NTA uses effective labor and effective consumers to measure the period. The period may vary by country or region within a country. It may also vary by sex. As mentioned earlier, this is the weakness of conventional demographic measurement using chronological age, such as 15 or 25 as an upper limit of young period and 65 as a lower limit of old period. However, we know that some people under 15 or 25 are already contributing economically. Some people above 65 are still contributing economically, especially if there is no mandatory retirement. And some people between 15 and 64 are not contributing economically and productively. NTA uses effective labor to measure those in productive period. Effective labor is a modified working age population by considering labor force participation, employed or not, hours worked, and wages. A large number of working age population does not necessarily mean a large number of effective work labor. Large number of working age population with a small number of effective labor may not promote economic growth. NTA also uses effective consumer to measure those in young and old period. It does not refer to simply number of consumers, but also their actual consumption. There can be many consumers, but their consumption may be low. NTA uses support ratio, not dependency ratio. It is a correction of dependency ratio. Support ratio is ratio of effective labor and effective consumers. Labor productivities. It is another important element in NTA. A further study of NTA. Standard of decent consumption. Deficit and surplus should be related to a standard of decent consumption, such as poverty line, people at risk of poverty or social exclusion. It may be a surplus, but of low quality. For example, effective labor may produce income, but not much. Effective consumers may not consume much. Total consumption can still be lower than income, but this may not necessarily be what decent consumption should be. Therefore, we should examine whether income or transfer can minimize capability deprivation, not only among older people, but also others such as disabled, those who are poor or near poor. Andre has mentioned correctly about wealth gap to measure the resources needed for old age financial adequacy. NTA data include family transfer, including transfer within the family, community transfer, and state transfer, including what individual can contribute by themselves. NTA then becomes an important tool in studies on social protection. To what extent a government should intervene in welfare of the individuals? Andy concluded that there will be no more population-driven economic growth. That's correct. And it shifts to the important role of human capital, not number of population, not number of working age population. The orientation is shifting to SDGs, beyond GDP growth. Examples are eradication of poverty and lowering inequality. Data from NDA can certainly be used to analyze the impact of population dynamics on SDGs. ND also concluded that there will be shift in the regional economic growth towards Central Asia, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. This assumes no major changes in the pattern of regional population mobility, not limited to migration, but including short-term population mobility and virtual population mobility. This conclusion also assumes that there is no change in increase in productivity, especially the use of digital technology, including artificial intelligence and robotic technology. This also assumes no role of outward FDI in economic growth. Andy also showed mixed impact of aging population on economic growth, negative and positive, and I will not repeat it here. Here are some policies interventions which we can use to prevent the gloomy picture from aging population. First, we can promote high, especially digital technology, including artificial intelligence and robotic technology. This will increase labor productivity. Second is to abolish mandatory retirement age, and number of effective labor will rise. Third is to use active aging framework, and health expenditure will decrease and old age income will increase. As a result, older people becomes asset for younger generation, and the need for social assistance will decline, improving state budget sustainability. And then create older people intensive job. This will increase effective labor. We also need to improve older people friendly infrastructure, as it will reduce effective consumer. We may also try to abolish ageism in workplace. This will increase effective labor. Policy should be beyond economic growth. It should be talking about SDGs. Higher standard of living is not simply measured by monetary income, even in high-income countries. More time may be needed to enjoy leisure, time not used for earning income. Now I will talk some further works on NDA. First is subgrouping by sex. Dynamics of effective labor and effective consumer may be different between male and female. Reproductive period, for example, clearly affects effective labor and effective consumer among female population. The current NTA assumes that all members of the same household are identical, ignoring household decision-making and living arrangement. It also assumes that there is no self-consumed household production, an underestimate of the support ratio. The current NTA framework assumes a closed population, no contribution from population mobility. Indeed, number of effective labor and effective consumer can depend very much on population mobility. Currently, the population projection has not given much attention to population mobility. Worse, current population projection does not pay attention to short-term population mobility, through short-term population mobility plays an important role on effective labor and effective consumers. Furthermore, we now have virtual mobility, going nowhere but being everywhere. This clearly affects effective labor and effective consumers, freely crossing the border. With multi-regional NTA, the effect of global GDP redistribution may not be as drastic as predicted with the uni-regional NTA. People from sub-Saharan Africa may move short-term or long-term or virtually to other regions and boosting economic growth in the region of destination. The multi-regional NTA is particularly important in a large country where internal population mobility is very important in economic development. As inequality may occur within a household or family, transfer of resources may also happen within a household or family. Further NTA works should consider this. NTA may consider a model of population projection involving household living arrangements such as pro-family model. Finally, there is a need of better global database, including flow of people and resources regionally. NTA has provided many useful policy recommendations, and I am looking forward to knowing the expansion of the NTA framework. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Eris. I will give a few minutes to Andy and Ron if they want to make any responses to Eris's presentation. And if not, we will open up to the floor. I think I already wrote in the chat. Anyone who wants to say anything, please write your question into the chat, or please use the raise hand button at the bottom, and we can call on you. I don't think there are that many people, and we can have this an informal discussion, oral discussion, instead of having to read questions in the chat.
Perhaps I could start with a few responses to Aris's comments. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, thanks very much to Aris. These are very deep and interesting comments, and I got many ideas from them. But I think it would be, first of all, I should say what Andy presented is based on NTA, but NTA combined with United Nations population projections, and United Nations population projections include their projections of international migration, not the kind of short-term labor mobility that Aris was also talking about, but the longer, the international migration flows are indeed reflected in these results that were presented. Now, NTA itself is it's an accounting framework, and it doesn't really, what should I say? It doesn't tell us anything about the future. It doesn't tell us anything about the past. It has no dynamic aspect unless we make additional assumptions and employ it to try to address a broader range of problems. And so, yes, we have emphasized in our work the supply side, as Aris points out, and not the demand side. The same NTA accounting framework estimates could, I guess, be used, could be interpreted in terms of demand. I don't know exactly how that would go, but I'd like to think more about it. In terms of one of the first things you said, Aris, about you thought what you were going to see is age standardized GDP or something of that sort. Well, that's an interesting idea. I guess the closest thing we do to that, I mean, you could do it at the aggregate level, but what we put a lot of emphasis on is aggregate consumption per effective consumer. Well, that's a kind of age standardized consumption measure. And that sort of measure could be replicated for many other outcomes, but I think that one's particularly relevant because it's also reflecting the fact that in a more slowly growing population, you don't need as high a savings rate and so on. I'll just say a couple more things and then stop. International capital markets, very important. That can be addressed in a projection framework if you make various other assumptions, and I've tried to do some things on that, but that's not in this paper. Doing NTA by sex, yes, that has now been done. Also, NTA for including home production based on time use surveys by sex has been done for about 30 countries now around the world. The multi-regional NTA, well, subregions within a big country like China or India, or for that matter, Mexico or Nigeria. In some cases, that work some work has been done or it's underway. It's underway in Nigeria. Some has been done on Mexico. I'm not sure where else, but yes, that seems like a valuable thing. Well, there were many other ideas in what Aris said. I want to go back over that and try to digest some of them, the SDGs and so on. We've tried to do applications to that. That's not included here. But there are many broad ideas that are we need to think about, and thank you very much for your comments, Aris. Maybe Andy would like to add something.
Yes, Andy.
Yeah, let me just add a few words. One, I love having Aris as a discussant because he's so modest, but yet so knowledgeable and offered us a lot of very good suggestions. I also want to emphasize again that this work is the effort of over 70 people. And although it was quite blurry and the font was small, they were listed early in the presentation, and they're going to be listed where you can see who they are in a paper coming out in Population and Development Review shortly. The only thing I want to add of substance to Ron's comments has to do with the closed economic model. So Aris is right in that we are not really looking at how population age structure is going to affect trade or international capital flows or exchange rates or anything like that. But the accounts themselves do not assume a closed economic model. So they include transfers from the rest of the world or assets that, I don't know, Saudi Arabia has all over the world and generates income, and they can bring back into Saudi Arabia and support their population. So there are remittances in the Philippines, and so people in the Philippines can consume a lot more than they produce through their labor. Well, these things are all part of national transfer accounts, although, and we've analyzed that some, but there's certainly an awful lot more that could be done in that area. So thanks for raising it. So that's all I have to say.
Okay, we now have time, quite a bit of time, for questions or remarks from the audience. I don't see anybody's hands raised or any questions in chat. People may have tried to raise their hand. If you have something to say and that I have not been able to see your hand raised, please just unmute yourself. I think that's quite possible. Or if Aris wants to respond also, please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you very much to Andy and Ron. It's very nice to see you. You are the founders of NTA. I'm an outsider comment. This is, I know very little, so your explanation has given me much better understanding of NTA. And I am looking forward that NTA can be expanded. And it has been very useful, I think, very useful. And it can be more useful in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I see one person finally who has raised their hand. Daniel Goodkind, if you could unmute yourself.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I see my name on the screen. I'll just, that's fine. Yeah, thank you very much for these presentations. This has been very helpful for me. I'm joining this conference as an independent, but I've used the NTA in my official work. And I'm just thinking or trying to think broadly about whether demographers still care about population size. It seems like NTA is focused quite a bit on age and sex structure, but I'm trying to think about some counterfactual scenarios. I'm thinking of some of the big questions that are out there. There's, for instance, I'm interested in China's population program. And I'm trying to think through counterfactual scenarios of where China would be today if it had not put its fertility restrictions in place. And according to a counterfactual model by some of our colleagues, if China had not put in those programs beginning in 1970, that's a decade before the one-child program, China today would have 2 billion people. That's about 600 million more than it actually has. So I'm trying to think through, maybe you guys can help me out. Can I use, I mean, Ron Lee just mentioned you can't really go in the future or you can't really go into the past, but if I'm recalling correctly, the consumption and the production by age are fixed. So if you're trying to run a counterfactual to see where China would be with 2 billion people, the consumption pattern would be very different than has recently been observed, as well as the production. So I'm trying to think, I'm looking for some help from economists as to how to get to this really big question that a lot of people are interested in. So can you offer us some advice?
I didn't mean to say NTA can be used to investigate questions about the future, but you have to bring in additional assumptions and you have to bring in population projections and so on. Yes, you could use it for the kinds of counterfactual projections you're talking about. You don't have to assume that these profiles remain the same in 10 years as they are today. You can assume they're rising with productivity growth, for example, as we do in this paper, but you have to make some assumptions then about what productivity growth is and how it changes over time, if it does, and so on. Yeah, so I guess that's what I would say. I would also say, but this isn't the session to discuss it, that the sort of the causal analyses I've seen suggest that about a third of the Chinese fertility decline in the 1970s was due to population policy, and 2/3 was just due to general socioeconomic change. But as I said, this isn't the place to, this isn't the session to discuss those matters. Anyway, thank you for the question.
Yeah.
Let me add an observation here, Daniel. I kind of agree with you about emphasis on age structure and not on size. And one of the things that we really wanted to do in this paper was to shift the focus a little bit more on size. And that was kind of our first point, was that GDP growth, so not looking at per capita GDP, but looking at total GDP and what we thought was going to happen to that, and that it was going to slow. And I think mostly we think that's probably a pretty good thing, and that it would have environmental effects. And so it kind of goes, I think, to your point about China and what would have happened in China if the population had been 2 billion, or you could ask what would have happened in China if GDP were like, 50% more than it is now. How would that have affected environmental effects in China? Well, I think it would have been disastrous, but I don't really have much expertise in this area. And so it really depends on other people like you and people who work on environmental effects and so forth to pick this up and use our data to address these kind of issues.
Right. I mean, I could give you the raw demography. I can give you the age sex distributions and the counterfactuals, but I don't know how to adjust the consumption and production patterns. I just don't have that skill set. But I'm interested in the question, and I wish I knew more about how to approach that that question.
Yeah, Daniel, I'm an outsider to the NTA, different from Andy and Ron, who are the real founders of NTA. So I've never worked on NTA. So how I view as outsider, the one which I really like best about NTA is the emphasis on productivity. That's very important. They started with age, number of age, but then they go to the productivity, to effective labor and effective consumer. And the one I like very much about NTA is the data, is an accounting framework that provide intergenerational flow. So I'm very interested that it could be applied to the welfare of the people. That's why I asked Andy and Ron to expand it, not limited to economic growth, but about poverty, about welfare. And I think as an outsider, I think I'm looking forward to this promising work on the NTA. Thank you.
Are there any plans to offer different production or consumption patterns or ways to play around with those? I mean, I haven't looked at NTA for a while, but is there more than one scenario there now, or is it just that single one?
Well, there are some papers that we have done. I think Ron and I have both done papers, and others have that have looked at you know, shifting the age of retirement. And you know, we have time series data that Gretchen Dunhauer and Ron have on the US that shows what's happened to labor income profiles in the US over the last 30 years or almost 40 years.
Yeah.
But, you know, and so labor income at older ages in the US has increased quite a bit. And we're getting other data like that. We have data for UK that we just uploaded, a long time series of labor income and consumption profiles. And so that kind of provides the material that's needed to do the analysis that you're suggesting. We're doing some scenarios already, but it would be nice to do more empirical statistical analysis, and not just our guesses about what might happen in the future. Ron, maybe you have some thoughts on that.
No, I wonder if anyone else has questions or comments.
I don't see any other hands raised. If no one else wants to say anything, I have a couple of comments myself, so they're very much off topic a little bit. Now, no one is raising their hand. For me, sometimes when you're talking about age structure, and a lot of this is looking at age structure effects, there are some extraordinarily rapidly aging populations across the world. And one of the big tendencies across almost all the world is population aging. When you talk about borrowing from the kind of the future from the next generation, if you're talking about supporting the old population, they need resources, they need food. You cannot borrow food from 5 years ahead from now. It's a transfer from people who are alive now to support people. And you might be borrowing money to the future, but you aren't. I think sometimes it's good just to throw out money and think, what is the actual transfers in terms of goods and services that are needed, and where does it come from, and how does this work? And to some extent, increasing productivity, AI, robotics, all of this can give services, but to a certain extent, who is going to wash the old person who needs support in Japan? And you can't borrow from the future for that. There's got to be somebody who is there who's doing it. You can maybe borrow to pay them from the future, but you can't borrow the physical hands to do it. And I think that gives a different perspective on how to do this and how do you handle this. A lot of your work, I think, essentially comes down to kind of the public. How does society arrange itself? And in traditional society, and I think even today in Northern societies, rich societies, family remains extremely important. But if you have very low birth rates, there's often no family there that can really help. or it's extraordinarily difficult to put burdens on them? And how do people arrange themselves to replace the family for these things that the family used to do, the private? And I'll just give you, I'm just throwing out ideas right now, but a few years ago, I met a woman, she was from Norway, and she had no kids, and all of her close friends had no kids. And they said, we're going to create our own family, kind of a mutual assistance society. And there are about 20 of them. And they said, we know we're getting old together. We are going to do activities together to reinforce. We're going to create kind of an implicit contract. And when one of us needs help, the others agree to help them. So it's kind of replacing the family with a new entity. And I thought this was just really interesting. How is society going to reconstruct itself to deal with population aging? And I don't think international trade can really help all the time, because so many countries across the world are aging. You can't borrow from China if China is aging also. You might be able to borrow from India for a while, but that may be limited too. How is society in the world going to rearrange itself to ensure that there are adequate resources and services for the old people? And I think removing kind of the constructive money kind of gives a different optic on how to think of this.
Yeah, Tom, that's very good observation, and that's also my concern, and that's why I'm very interested on NTA. I'm outsider because NTA provide data, is an accounting framework to understand the flow of money. So I think from the data from NTA, we could go to the discussion on the social protection system, the welfare system, and NTA itself, excuse me, I'm sorry if I'm wrong, Andy and Ron. The NTA itself is provide the data, and then we have to expand and to work together with other disciplines like public finance and so on. And I'm also looking forward to further study, I'm sorry, to study how to finance the older people. Thank you.
Well, I can say, okay, you want to go ahead, Ron? Go ahead.
I wanted to say two things, if I can keep them in mind. Well, the first and most mechanical is, well, NTA isn't just about money, because we're also interested in transfers within the household that are of goods, in-kind transfers. And now we're interested in the time component of home production, much of which is the so-called care economy of caring, time used to care for children, time used to care for elderly, or time used by elderly to care for grandkids. And all of these things are now part of NTA, or what is called NTTA for time transfer accounts. I also wanted to very briefly address the first, and I think the only one I can address of Tom's important points, which is, I think I can address okay, so what happens if we drop money and think of it in real terms? What are the elderly going to eat? Well, I think the way you borrow from the future real things is you have to persuade someone today not to consume so much, not someone else not to eat so much food, and to say, okay, we'll let the old person eat it in exchange for a promise that someone's going to let me eat something in the future. Well, so that's a real change that's happening. It's not a monetary change. You're trying to use promises about the future, and therefore imposing some sort of burden on future generations, to get people to change their behavior today in such a way that they make more resources available for the elderly, which could include time spent caring for the elderly too, with a kind of promise that something of the sort would be available in the future. We certainly do see that over the course of time and over the course of economic development, there's a big shift from the share of, let's say, GDP that is transferred through the private sector, which is basically the whole story initially, that shrinks, and the transfers through the public sector grow. And on average, something like half of GDP is transferred either through the private or the public sectors, but the composition changes with development. And I suppose that's going to continue and maybe get reinforced as the family becomes less substantial. Anyway, yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Well, let me say, I think we do have this system of intergenerational transfers that can operate in an important way in an economy, but it's also true that transfers received and transfers given have to balance at any point in time. And I think that's one of the aspects of NTA that's very important in a way to communicating to policymakers and to people at large that, you're not going to solve the problem of aging unless you either reduce consumption of seniors or raise taxes paid by workers. And, they have to balance in some way. There are some little ways around that, but basically that's true, I think. Let's see, the other thing I wanted to say is, the way old people can, you can invest. We don't depend just on transfers. And so we can plant apple trees and use that to fund our consumption, to use a Econ 101 example. And I think that's very important in the international context. To me, one of the biggest issues globally is that there will be a tremendous amount of capital generated in rich countries. And we're really going to be in trouble if that cannot be effectively used, productively used in countries in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia, who, at least for a while, are going to have a lot more workers and could really use a lot of capital to enrich their countries. And so, at least for the short term, I think that this is a very important issue and can help us a lot if things go well.
If there's time for one more thing, I wanted to pick up on something else Aris said. Well, you had much more detailed comments about poverty and inequality and so on, but there is quite a bit of work now in doing NTA by socioeconomic status. So for subgroups of the population, which generally, for various reasons, mostly it seems to work best to define these in terms of the educational level of the individual or the household head, rather than income, but it can be done in other ways. So that's been done, and I think is quite, you see new things that way. The other thing is we're starting to do micro level NTA, where you're actually looking at distributions across individuals. And we're at fairly early stage on that, but we're hoping that will lead in interesting directions as well. So thank you.
Are there any other questions? I'm looking around. Would any of the speakers like to say anything else? I don't see anyone raising their hand. I don't see anyone requesting to speak. It's 10 minutes past the hour. We could end early, and we'll leave the Zoom room open if anyone wants to speak informally.
Well, I just wanted to thank you, Tom, for organizing this. It's a great opportunity to be able to talk about this at IUSSP.
Yeah.
So thank you.
I think this is a real opportunity, and you guys are so well known for all of the work you've done in this area, and not just NTA, but I know the work of Ron. I read when I did my doctoral studies years and years ago. your work is incredibly important. And I appreciate also Aris and Anta's comments. It's very interesting.
Thank you very much too. Thank you, Andy, for suggesting me to discuss your paper. I'm learning a lot about NTA.
Okay, I guess no one is raising their hand. So unless anyone has an urgent desire to speak, we can just end the recording of the session, leave the room open if anyone wants to speak, to continue talking.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Tom,
Thank you.
Aris, and everyone.
Thanks, Doris.